And now Maria Kochkina, who is actually physically here, she wrote a chapter on the concealment of the state.
Is it okay? I feel really privileged to be among this group and among some of my favorite philosophers and authors. I feel very happy about that. So I currently write about the philosophy of nature and radical ecology, and I put myself within the feminist and anarcho-communist line of thinking. It's actually interesting how anarchist thought is actually not concerned with thinking about the state. Although this sounds counterintuitive, but this is true, that most of anarchist theory does not deal with thinking with the state, but something beyond the state. But I claim that today we precisely need to think about the state in the time of global problems like climate change. For example, in her famous speech, Greta Thunberg appealed to the states in the United Nations, but I ask whether does the state really matter when global capitalism and ecology is concerned that do not know any borders, and especially national ones. So Jason Royce Lindsay, a contemporary anarchist thinker, also starts with this point that the state uses this idea of globalization and expansion of capital to get rid of responsibility and accountability of its action. So Lindsay thinks that the state literally conceals itself, moves its operation to the deep, to what is called the deep state, so that it unveils a network of secrecy, and that we can't know what is really its agenda, what it really wants. But I argue that, in contrast to Lindsay, that the state does not actually need any conspirology like this. It might have it, but it might as not do that, because it has three really effective ideological strategies. So the contemporary democratic Western state, I'll give examples later, claims that it has free economy, democracy, and ecological politics, ecological policies. So these are the three pillars on which the concealment of the state rests. So I'll give the example of the third one. I think that about democracy and how it is used to disguise the state. Josie Dean wrote brilliantly in her book Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies, so I will not stop on that. But I'll just say about how states claim to be ecological when they are not. For example, if we think about states like Norway and Sweden, who claim to have really progressive ecological policies, we can see that what they actually do is export their waste and export their pollution to the global south. So, for example, Norway has has a big policy of promoting electric cars. So there are a lot of Teslas in Oslo. But the fun thing is that they fund this policy with oil money, with selling of oil. So this way they kind of move their ecological impact just to a different zone. And this way also Sweden, we can say that it funds its ecological, democratic, and other policies, even socialist democratic policies, with the money that the big transnational corporations like H&M and IKEA bring to the country without paying any taxes and having a huge ecological impact in the countries like Bangladesh. What do we do with this predicament? Lindsay claims that if the state is this powerful really, we need to use a very usual anarchist strategy, autonomism. We need to make our own networks. We need to create autonomous zones and so on. So, and in the chapter that I wrote, I completely disagree with that. I don't like the idea of autonomy, and I also don't think it's actually viable or practical in any way. Not only because, not from a theoretical point of view, but from a pragmatic point of view, if you look at the ecological problems that we have, where we have to have the state to act, because we don't have any bigger actors as for today. So I propose that the attitude which we need to adopt is the cynicism towards the state. I have not theorized, I have not written about it a lot. I'm still figuring out what this cynicism is. But what I mean by that is that we need to be in the state, even as anarchists, use it to its best capacities, but not to get co-opted by it. So if you remember the phrase by Trump, which is now very famous and quoted all the time, when he called his opposition the Marxists, the anarchists, the looters, and the people who in many instances have absolutely no clue what they do. So I claim that we actually have to become all of this, but especially the looters. How I understand this looting, political looting of the state, is similar to how American philosopher and Black theorist Fred Morton described a position of the intellectual in the modern university. So I am going to quote the book, which is called The Black Undercurrents, and the essay on the university, but I'm going to change the word university with the state. And then this is what I mean by the cynicism attitude. It cannot be denied that the university, and in my case, the state, is a place of refuge. And it cannot be accepted that the state is a place of enlightenment. Or in our case, it's a it's a source of power and resources, right? In the face of these conditions, one can only sneak into the state and steal what one can, to abuse its hospitality, to spite its mission, to join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, to be in, but not of. I think that to adopt a cynical attitude means that we need to stop believing in the state and always assume that it won't do anything for us unless it doesn't have any other choice.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. Some of the anarchist touch here sometimes can be healthy. And now Agon Hamza, who I know has to run soon after his talk. So if you want to pose questions to Agon, so particularly important to do it relatively fast. So Agon Hamza, are you now in the University of Skopje, right?
Yes.
Yes, from the University of Skopje.
Science and Humanities in Skopje.
You're welcome.
So can I begin?
Yes.
Thank you very much for this. It's a great honor to be in this great conference or book launch or whatever we want to call it. So I want to divide my talk into two main parts. That is to say, in between the phenomenology of spirit and the philosophy of right, both books written by Hegel. These are the names of politics and the state. The thesis which I would like to propose, therefore, is that the space in between the two is essential in our current situation. Following Slavoj Žižek, I argue that today we need a reversal of going back from Marx to Hegel, that the reversal of going back from Marx to Hegel gains its relevance. In the terms of conjuncture, we are closer to the Hegelian rather than Marxian universe. While Marx was writing on a revolutionary situation of 1848 and aftermath, identifying and theorizing the contradictions that may lead to the revolution, Hegel was mostly concerned with the effects of the revolution in a post-revolutionary situation. I think, again, following Žižek, that we are in a similar conjuncture today. The period of the socialist revolutions is over and capitalism is already a global system. We need to radically rethink the idea of communism. Marx's famous response to Proudhon's The Philosophy of Poverty was to return the message in its inverted form, the poverty of philosophy. Today, when the value of thinking has become itself measured by the standards of the incessant activity and production that organize all forms of labor, it may be time to supplement Marx's position. The crisis of the left is no longer the crisis of idealism, of a poor philosophy, disconnected from the material basis that conditions it. Ours is a poverty of philosophy, of an absence of any form of thinking subtracted from the imperative of compulsive activity. A return to philosophy has then a crucial role today. One, it means to reinvent the critical powers needed in order to interpret the world as it is. In Hegel's own words, philosophy is its own time apprehended in thoughts. Hegel famously claimed, I quote, "The wounds of spirit heal and leave no scars behind," the end of quote. We can read this statement either as a sign of totalizing unification, that is idealism, or as a sign of very groundlessness of the dialectical movement. The movement of spirit leaves no scars, leaves nothing behind, that is, because it is the healing that produces the wound. Spirit leaves behind not a trail of scar. It does not stick to what was already there, but a trail of phantasmatic wounds, losses that were never present to begin with, losses that had only being insofar as they were lost, which precisely because they were they are not events in a sense of reality, of identifiable interruptions into a continuum of time. They make no marks in history, that is, they make no scars. The wound of spirit leaves no scar because spirit does not work through ruptures in the fabric of history. It works by positing the presupposed loss and not by presupposing the positive. This strange process through which one loses what one never had allows us to get to the most difficult point in Hegelian thinking, and hence the actual reason why it is a thought so prone to all sorts of misunderstandings. If the proof of contingency is the lack of marks, then there are no marks of contingency. In this sense, teleological determinism is indistinguishable from historical contingency. If there are only retroactive events demarcated by what we lost after them, but never directly had access to them before, then there is no transcendental structure to guarantee not only that an event has taken place, but that there are events in the Hegelian system to begin with. To formulate this in rather dense terms, and I apologize for it, but I think it will become clearer later on. The proof of contingency is the very appearance of necessity, the illusion of one. Totality, the very lack of the mark of the multiple without totalization. The Hegelian history is the history of the impossible, later defined by Lacan as that which does not cease to write itself, just as the logic of Hegelian spirit, which does not cease to leave a scar behind. But how are we to proceed from this to the state? Or more precisely, how can we conceptualize, starting from this, the state in a Žižekian Hegelian orientation? If the absolute knowing is the culmination of the dialectical process, then the absolute of politics is the state. That is to say, politics does not begin with a state, but it always ends with a state. And this is, I think, a very important point. For Hegel, the exact form of regulation within a state is not the object of philosophical thought. What matters is the universal form of the state. We can even argue that politics should aim at taking over and transforming the state. It is in this matter, I think, or at least the way I read it, is that we should understand Hegel's affirmation of the state form not as a moment of conformity or a capitulation to the Prussian Empire back in his time, but as an affirmation of politics as such. Put differently, he does not regress from the position of active conscious to that of the beautiful soul. For Hegel, as for Žižek, the state is the answer to the problem of internationalism, as well as to the problem of the commons, neither of which fit borders or other limitations of this kind. Hegel was very well aware of this, and it is for this reason that the state is, again in his words, the march of God in the world. His is a state which is ultimately not representative of a nation or a community. For him, the state was tied to the problem of dealing with multiple nations, as was the case with Prussia, that is to say, the pre-German nation state. His understanding of Volksgeist cannot be interpreted in the spirit of national or romantic vision. Volksgeist does not create the character of a people, of a nation, but it is ultimately a result of its religious, cultural, and other traits. The creation of the state, based on the Volksgeist, is not that of a national state. The state is at a level of self-conscious. The modern world, in Hegel's view, contains a multiple of political units which are not held together by power but by spirit. So how should we follow on from this in what I think is very important thing to do, revitalizing the Hegelian theory of the state from the Žižekian standpoint? In its Žižekian conceptualization, or rather understanding, the state is not a representative one, but it's a strong body which does not only represent the people, but should include everyone in itself. This inclusion is not, so to speak, an easy solution. but it's rather a very important and crucial problem in every attempt to recuperate Hegelian theory of the state. And there is no easy answer to this problem of inclusion. I think it's very important not to succumb to some sort of liberal deviation of conceptualizing inclusion as such. The present time challenges us to overcome the constraint of the nation state and to move to universal form of political organization. I maintain that Zizek's four riders of the apocalypse will be the driving force towards a transnational unity. His wager is that the only way to cope with the challenges of late global capitalism is to move beyond the nation state form. And this is where Hegel is of crucial importance. He poses a penetrating challenge to the idea of a nation from the perspective of the state as idea. This is the challenge before which the good old socialism of the previous century failed and ended up in different sorts of deviation. One of them is succumbing to nationalism. The state was the name Hegel had for a self-determining and objective organizational infrastructure. This makes it exceptionally challenging and hard to evacuate of a specific political reading when its logic is not so tied to praise of the modern state. Therefore, and yet again, what does Hegel mean by the state? Every form of the modern state, as we know it, has very little, or rather, if anything at all, in common with the forms of political and social organization that Hegel calls the state. There are even some commentators of Hegel who claim that the state, as an idea in Hegel's philosophy of right, cannot be actualized or implemented. So it can only remain a matter of philosophical discussion and debates. But this non-identification or negative determination of the idea of the state with individual states challenges the conservative understanding of the state. This position renders an understanding on Hegel's idea rather difficult, as it does not side with any particular form of statehood, be historical or actual. In Hegel's political philosophy, there is little or no room for positive determination of the idea of the state, whose movement is both the material and historic existence of God. That is to say, God's march in the world. Thus, the following hypothesis can be put forward. What Hegel calls a state is the condition of historical existence. Whenever there is history, the organizational condition for it can be called a state. In this historicizing manner, one can argue, for example, that if the Paris Commune made history, then from this very perspective, for a Hegelian, it means that the Parisian proletarians had a state. And next year is the anniversary of the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune. So it makes some sense to refer to this event. Yet, in the Hegelian sense, in its capitalist form of social organization, the state is not a state. For here, it is reduced to a governmental structure, while its core remains the commodity form plus property laws. And I'm reaching the end, I think. This also means that bringing about a new theory of the state as the practice of the organization of objective conditions that we can create, then alienates ourselves from, and then also think and critique. In other words, the communist theory of the state should contain in itself the theory of conditions and possibilities for the creation of a historical dynamics that can affect the people, rather than being yet another theory of central government or committee, or call it as you like. The latter would be a theory of administration, which is a completely different domain. And to really conclude, this is why a communist theory of the state is a theory of all the practices that can lead us to relate to the objective spirit, that is, to recognize in our objective, concrete social existence some level of autonomy, that is, God's march in the world, which until now remains hidden beneath the national and communal borders of national or other territories. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. there was a comment in chat which is technical, like give us the titles, but we'll send them to you in the chat shortly. As I said, Agon has to run in 10 minutes. So exceptionally, if you have questions to Agon, you can ask them now. Thank you. Someone says, yes, this is to the technical issue. I wonder, Agon, to put things a little more dramatically, if there is not a problem in any state, and particularly in the contemporary state, that it by constitution, by logic, it is universal, but through sovereignty, it is tied to a certain location, as Michael and Alexander mentioned today. The state has to do with being somewhere, with Dasein. At the same time, of course, as you say, it is formulated in the universal language. All of the Constitution, I mean, doesn't have anything to do with a certain particular culture. So how can this be? Isn't there a dramatic tension between nationalism, between nation and state? And therefore, states should disappear for the sake of the universal state gradually, or, which is more likely, the opposite will happen. And they will gradually return to their parochial self-definition. Unmute yourself, unmute.
All right, yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot I have to deal with this. Can you hear me now, okay? Okay, well, first, of course, the ultimate goal, I believe, for everyone who is a communist and a Marxist is for the state to be dissolved or withered away, as Marx and Engels had it. But to put it in rather, as you said, dramatic, pragmatic terms, I don't see that happening anytime soon. You know, all the currents lead to the exact opposite of it. And I think it was Panagiotis, who mentioned the neoliberal state, which is in a way an oxymoron, and he was completely right in that. I think that the state in its actual form, as a, let's call it bourgeois form, in its bourgeois form, is only getting more powerful and in a rather perverted way, because it cannot deal with the problems posed by contemporary capitalism. We only have to think of COVID. You know, it's a tremendous form of international organization is needed to fight this bloody pandemic. You know, going back to a nation state is not a solution. I mean, to put it in Hegel's terms, consciousness cannot be happy with an old order. And this is how I see also the attempts to return to socialism in any of its forms. You know, be it democratic, be it whatever. I think that the challenges, and again, I'm following Zizek here, the four riders of apocalypse, compel us to think a transnational form of, call it political organization or whatever, in order, if you want to put it again in a yet dramatic terms, humanity to survive. But until then, the whole point is to make the state function in a non-statal manner, not return to some sort of authoritarianism or whatever. That would be a mistake.
Oops. Yeah. Maybe one more comment. Sorry that we occupy Christian's time, but Christian will have much time too. At the same time, what's happening now is that we increasingly see political divisions internationally, which coincide with certain historical cultural divisions. So if in the 90s we thought that eventually the liberal form will win everywhere, there was some illusions that many of us shared. Not necessarily the end of history, but it looked like there was a kind of general form of capital and state. But now, for example, I mean, some of you are from the south of Europe, and we increasingly see that this is a certain separate path, socially, politically, than the north of Europe. I don't think that the illusions of building the same prosperity and the same political regime everywhere are to stand. I don't know, maybe from Europe it looks different. Russia and Turkey, of course, went their own way. There is no way back, unfortunately, from this anytime soon.
No.
Not speaking of China. And why I'm saying this is that given the obvious universality of the constitution and of the exchange form, there is increasingly a separation of the big historical, confessional, national blocks.
No, I understand, but I think we should think of, I agree with you, but I think we should think of a rather interesting paradox. You know, as all of us here who are communists or Marxists, I mean, one of our keywords is internationalism, you know, but if you think about what the whatever we want to call them now, alt-right or far-right, from Trump to Putin, Erdogan, Duterte, and others, they are helping.
Oops, something happened to Agon.
Each other much more than we on the left can doing it. So it would be quite. Can you hear me okay?
Now, yes.
Okay. So I said, like, those on the right, they are, in a way, we can talk of the right-wing international today, you know, yeah. and that's really disastrous for the left and for communist beat thinking or politics in a rather practical sense. I think, and I'm just thinking of a few Marxist theorists or philosophers like Korjin Karatani and Fredrik Jameson, who have recently proposed, just very generically, Jameson proposed an army as universal form of organization, and Karatani proposed some sort of world governance. I mean, it's really necessary to think on forms of political organization which goes beyond beyond both this local activism as well as nation form.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you, Agon, and now we turn to our.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry I cannot be here till the end. Till the next time.
You'll watch the recording. Okay.
Okay.
Sure. Now we turn to our last speaker, if I'm not mistaken, Christian Sorace or Soros. I never know how to pronounce your last name correctly. Who wrote a very important chapter on the dismantlement of state in Mongolia.
Yeah.
And by the way, the table of content is now in the chat. You can look at it.
Thank you, Artem, for inviting me to be part of this volume and to speak today. So if I can just, I'll keep my remarks brief, and if I can just respond to what Agon just said about the Hegelian point that consciousness cannot be happy with an old order, working backward from the end of my chapter to the beginning. In the conclusion, I mentioned how in left-wing communism and infantile disorder, Lenin posits a transitional temporality in which parliaments are, quote, historically obsolete, end quote, from the standpoint of world history, but are not yet, quote, politically obsolete, end quote. So part of what I'm thinking through in this chapter is in Mongolia, as elsewhere in the post-Soviet world, the transition to the liberal parliamentary form of democracy, as Artyom just said, that 90s sense that that form will win everywhere, needed to subject Lenin to a certain erasure. And especially Lenin's point in left-wing communism, and resurrect what was otherwise an already a dead form. So I make the point by looking at Mongolia that we are living in the gray expanse between the democratic corpse and the communist specter that is yet to be incarnated in a body, or needs to find a new body. And so what I do in the chapter, as I'm both kind of a comparative political scientist as well as a political theorist, probably an amateur at both, but I move through the empirical example of post-socialist democratic Mongolia to glean some insights into the current historical conjuncture and broader contradictions between democracy and the state, and the sense of being haunted by, as Eric Santner would put it, missed historical opportunity, specifically the opportunities of communism, and how democratic ideology performs the exorcism of these ghosts. So first, now to go from the end to the beginning, the chapter begins by looking at the global context in the last several years with what I call the genre of democratic autopsy, which I argue is a liturgy for preserving the aura of liberal democracy. That is focusing on basically, especially in comparative politics, but also in journalism and the media, diagnoses of democracy dying, democracy in crisis, and a lot of themes that were also brought up today. The middle part of the chapter deals specifically with Mongolia, which I'll actually won't spend too much time focusing on. But it's important to point out that besides the Soviet Union, Mongolia was the world's second communist revolution, 1921 and 1924. And then in 1990 went through a peaceful democratic revolution and became what former Secretary of State of the US, John Kerry, referred to as, quote, an oasis of democracy, end quote, surrounded by its authoritarian neighbors. But Mongolia's democracy also seems to be showing signs of necrosis as power is increasingly consolidated in the hands of a former martial arts champion, business mogul, and populist outsider. Even though I absolutely agree, I forgot with who said it earlier. I think Artyom, you said it, the contradictory nature of the term populist. Populist outsider president who ran on suspiciously Trumpian sounding platform, Mongolia will win. In this section, which I will only be gesturing towards today, I argue that Mongolia's post-socialist democracy provides a striking example of how democracy has become a kind of liturgical practice and ideology emptied of popular sovereignty. The final part of the paper is a conversation with Lenin's ghost that haunts this impasse of democracy. So the chapter begins by an observation of how since 2016, democracy has been diagnosed in critical condition or for some pronounced dead, which is to say a lot of political science and journalistic writing has taken the form of prescriptive remedies, autopsies, or eulogies. I call this democracy autopsy genre, and later in the chapter, a mode of democratic necrophilia, indicating that there is a desire and investment and libidinal attachment in the figure of the corpse. To give a few examples, and we can run through them quickly, in 2017, the Washington Post changed its masthead to the ominous phrase, "Democracy dies in darkness." The Atlantic is running a series right now on democracy dying. Nearly 1 year later, in 2018, political scientists Levitsky and Zublat published a book, How Democracies Die, that has been on the New York Times bestseller list. A few weeks ago, I attended the American Political Science Association conference, and I was on a roundtable where a political scientist referred to democracy's comorbidities. I guess borrowing from the language of COVID. And political theorist Jason Frank gave an extended discussion of the history of democratic suicide, dating back to Tocqueville's discussion of that. But from the corpse, we can also radiate out to the even more prevalent discourse of democracy being in crisis. And despite their shared genealogy, crisis, as we know, is not the same as critique. In fact, as Janet Reutemann argued in her book, Anti-Crisis, the language of, quote, crisis always aims at and implicates a norm. What went wrong assumes a normative account of what ought to have happened, end quote. Therefore, despite its superficial negativity, there is something reaffirmative and norm-preserving in the language of democracy in crisis. Another problem with this discursive framework is that the question is democracy in crisis misleadingly presumes that we are already living in a democratic state. By rushing to save democracy from the clutches of death, we are convincing ourselves that what we are saving is actually democracy. Our anxiety about losing democracy reassures us that it was something we once had and inhabited, a sovereignty that was once ours but is now being taken from us. For example, in Levitsky and Zilblatt's How Democracies Die, their entire argument can be boiled down that to save democratic institutions, it is necessary to repair the gates that keep out the populists and barbarian riffraff. And I'm not being poetic here. Their argument is literally that Trump was made possible in the US, and then they give comparative examples throughout the globe. But that populist outsiders were made possible by a breakdown in the gatekeeping function of political parties. But rather than see this dismantling of the gates as a fraught opportunity, and nevertheless perhaps a necessary one, to reconceptualize how democracy is organized, lived, and practiced, as has been discussed in our book launch today, the message of Levitsky and Zilblatt is entirely conservative one, committed to preserving the status quo. And perhaps I'm not being generous here, but I don't feel like I need to be. Their version of democracy to me can be summarized by Flaubert's reflections on academia, when Flaubert wrote, "I have always tried to live in an ivory tower, but a tide of shit is beating at its walls, threatening to undermine it," end quote. So I'm also in the background, I'm thinking a lot of Rancière's hatred of democracy actually being invoked right now in the language of the preservation of democracy and democracy being in crisis. After that, as part of the theoretical organization of this argument, I turn to Wendy Brown's argument that the exaltation of democracy, which has become a form of world religion, has occurred alongside and contributed to a process of de-democratization and a retreat from political engagement into private commodified life. So here you have this almost, dialectical movement of extremities of democracy becomes like the world religion that's praised and fetishized, while democracy itself is drained of any substantive meaning. As Brown poignantly puts it, we are all Democrats now, but what is left of democracy? End quote. I just want to point out, last time I gave this talk at that political science panel, political theorist Banu Bargu raised a really interesting question of Brown's own recent writing and attachments, and she seems to herself be caught up a little bit in this mourning of democracy with a tinge of a kind of elitist nostalgia for a specific form of democracy. We could talk about that as well. Okay, but to answer Brown's question of what is left of democracy, I take a cue from her own language of exaltation and argue that what remains of democracy is the kind of dimming aura of democratic liturgy. The concept of democratic liturgy I derives from Giorgio Agamben, and I want to pass over here Agamben's recently, at least for me, embarrassing remarks about the COVID pandemic. And just focus on Agamben's argument that public opinion in mass-mediated democracies is a site of liturgical practice that generates glory and acclamation. And, you know, y'all are a lot of, you know, everybody is scattered in different countries right now, but writing here from Colorado, US, 2 weeks before this horrendous so-called election, you know, it's not wrong that what we're being inundated with are almost a kind of hysterical mode of acclamation of an undemocratic democracy. From cable news, classrooms, informal conversations, online discussions, I voted stickers, obituaries of democracy's deaths, these sermons saturate discursive space. Far from being a practice of self-determination, democracy has become an instrument of self-exaltation. As soon as someone goes against the church or questions parliamentary democracy as the horizon of our politics, as Alain Badiou has pointed out, they are treated as heretics, threatened with excommunication or even death, depending on their skin color and where they are from. So my argument in this chapter is basically that the mainstream discourse of democracy being in a mode of crisis is actually a form of liturgy, an attempt to preserve its aura. In a state of danger, its aura starts to glow again. The imagined task of liberal democratic resistance is to heroically drive the barbarians from the palace rather than to occupy or to dismantle and rebuild the palace. Not the palace, or people's palace. What got me thinking about the liturgical aspects of democracy was a scene from a conference in Ulaanbaatar, which, you know, we should know if we don't already, that Ulaanbaatar in Mongolian means red hero, which I think is nice. So this conference hosted by the US-based Independent Research Institute, or IRI, which I assume many of you are familiar with. And the conference was called Democracy in the 21st Century, Challenges and Way Forward. One of the keynotes was a big name comparativist who's actually written, who kind of made his name writing about post-90s Russia, M. Stephen Fish. Again, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He gives this keynote, and during the keynote, the signifier democracy and its repetition started to detach from any substantive reference. And as it pounded away at the temples, insisting in its tautological glory, the way that democracy was being discussed then it really detached from any awareness or any relevance or resonance with the Mongolian context. A local anthropologist turned to me and sarcastically remarked that the keynote reminded him of a combination of Soviet-era propaganda and CNN media coverage fused together in the name of democracy. So after sitting through this, I had to get up and walk around for a bit. And so I went to look at the tables at the front of the conference, and they all had glossy brochures that you could take for free, that they're retelling the narrative of how democracy was born in Mongolia. And so I asked one of the conference organizers why they were commemorating the democratic revolution at this particular moment in time, and he directly responded, quote, "Mongolia's democracy is in need of re-enchantment," end quote. The need for re-enchantment called to mind how Inspectors of Marx, written by Derrida in the early 90s, how Derrida described the celebration of the end of history as a, quote, manic, jubilatory, and incantatory form, end quote, that Derrida related to Freud's concept of mourning. As if democracy then, in the early 90s, at this height of liberal exuberance, it was trying to convince itself that, as Derrida puts it, quote, "Marx is dead, communism is dead, very dead, and along with its hopes, its discourse, its theories, and its practices. It says, long live capitalism, long live the market, here's to the survival of economic and political liberalism," end quote. As if at this moment of victory of liberal democracy over Soviet ideology, of course, liberal democracy is itself an ideology, I'm just, you know, positing it in those terms, ideology was needed more than ever to shore up and to quiet the gnawing anxieties within liberal democracy. So here, Derrida, in the early 90s, profoundly and presciently grasps the dialectical relationship between the liturgical celebration of liberal democracy and the ritual exorcism of the multiple ghosts of Derrida limits himself to Marx, but I would add, whereas he wouldn't, Lenin as well. So in my concluding remarks, I want to argue that exorcism is not just a cute kind of goth way of, metaphorically way of speaking, but is actually functions as an effective dissemination of ideology. To summarize the progression of my argument here, when democracy does not actually involve the distribution and practice of sovereign power, when it does not challenge the inequalities of capitalism, and creates this sense of alienation and lack of trust in institutions, and then democracy in Mongolia, the democracy is celebrated, but the practice of the state is entirely detached from it. And then the people themselves are kind of trapped in this depoliticizing enemy. That this situation requires liturgy to continuously reaffirm itself and to veil its absence. So when re-enchantment doesn't work or starts to lose its aura, exorcism becomes the liturgy of last resort. And here, Mongolia's socialist history takes over the heavy lifting. And I don't think he's here, and I'll probably mispronounce his name, so I apologize but Ilya for God's sakes. Artyom, can you help me out here? You know who I'm talking about.
Ilya Budraitskis. No, I don't think he's in the audience.
Okay, Ilya Budraitskis. When we were at a conference, he recommended to me an article he wrote about this process, and I'm also drawing from his work, which was excellent. On I think it was called "The Hunt for the Red Subject" or Homo Sovieticus or something like that. And we see something very similar happening in Mongolia, where a lot of the problems and contradictions and crises of the parliamentary form and of capitalism are being blamed on the socialist past. It comes in handy. To kind of explain away the issues of the present. So exorcism of Mongolia's socialist past continues to be performed at the bedside of Mongolia's ailing democracy. The socialist legacy becomes the explanation for democratic failure. In a recent article, political scientist Monk Erden characterizes Mongolia's parliament as a Frankenstein hybrid of parliamentary democracy and socialist systems, and blames the failures of the parliamentary democracy, quote, I love this, as a direct inheritance of the communist father, end quote. And he continually refers to communism as the bad father. So the problem for Monk Erden among the new democratic elite is not the congenital flaws in the model of democracy imported and copied from the US and Europe, but the bad DNA of the communist father. The political commentator Balushka observes, as Mongolia's democracy plunges into crisis, quote, it is not accidental that posts are being written day and night about returning to communism and how the populists are going to destroy our country, end quote. The threat of a regression to communist, quote, is an ingrained habit of telling a story you've repeated your whole life, end quote. So the question I think that my chapter raises and that I just want to leave us with today is, why is democracy perpetually warding off the specter of communism? Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Okay. Now, I understand that it's late, but we have a chance to have a general discussion, and maybe the public has comments or questions, please, or we have questions and comments to each other. I think it was, okay, here is the question. Maybe, Artem, can we unmute Sebastian? Sebastian Calderon, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, can you just say what you wrote here?
Yes, of course. Thank you all to the contributors. I teach at New York University and I work on performance and the state, performance theory and the state. So yes, I wanted to ask this question related to the state and neoliberalism. So in a recent interview, the scholar of neoliberalism, Philip Mirowski, critique the way neo-Marxist scholars continue to underestimate neoliberalism as merely capitalism with a new facade, with a new face, no? And not, as he argues, as a radically new conceptualization of the market as this epistemologically privileged information processor, and of humans just as the terrain, no, the entrepreneurial terrain upon which this market expands. And what he suggests is that to counter this particular neoliberal hegemony, we need to be thinking about different ideas of both the human and the market. And here I thought of Bashkina's directing ideas, no, representations, new representations of the human and the market to be developed and mobilized. So I was just curious from the speakers of what they make of this argument and what ideas of the human and the market, I think already some are been latent in the conversation, can we contemplate? Thank you all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Who wants to answer? I can only say that I agree. What can you say? This goes back to this exchange we had with Panagiotis, that the very terms of both the state and the market have to be rethought fundamentally, logically. And I do agree that, of course, neoliberalism is not simply about the market. It's a new form of the state, which gets rid of the illusion of anything natural in the market. That's why I think that we should just build on this and realize that there is nothing natural in the democracy. It should be built up, both top down and bottom up.
Well, if I may, since you mentioned me, well, I do agree that neoliberalism brings forward not just more markets, but this idea that the market is the terrain of social rationality par excellence, which in a certain way also points to the inherently undemocratic character of neoliberalism, in the sense that there's no actual space for democratic initiative or democratic sovereignty, exactly because it is considered by definition less rational than the market. So yes, I agree that neoliberalism is about the production of subjectivity, it's the production of a way of thinking. It has this anthropological dimension facilitated by the expansion of the market and the commodification of aspects that were until now left aside. I'm not sure whether this means moving beyond capitalism. I think that this logic is in a certain way inscribed in the value form in the capitalist market from the beginning. And you can see this in the tension between liberalism and democracy, even in classical, political philosophy of modernity. But this is a different story. But I do agree, and I do agree that a counter-hegemonic, political project should try to, in a certain way, to embrace this kind of, thinking in a way of trying to challenge all its aspects, offer an antagonistic, not just economic policy, but a way of thinking, a way of subjectivity, collective rationality, and in a certain way anthropology. In a certain way, this is the opposition we are facing. This suggests the challenge. In this sense, I do agree with the challenge posed. We're not competing on the same terrain with neoliberalism, with suggesting a completely different rearticulation of the political and the social and the economic. If this is inscribed within, a Hegelian conception, as Agon suggested, that would be interesting also to see, because I do think that in a certain way, in Hegel, you don't simply see the state as rationality. You think you see the challenge of how to rethink a rational political constitution in the broadest sense of the term, a rational way to organize social life. But that's also another point. It was just my comment on Agon. Unfortunately, he's not here. Anyway, that's.
Of course, there is different rationality. There is rationality and reason. I would say that my point would be to go to the state of reason from the state of understanding, which is Hegel's point.
But at the same time, if I may add, the market is a bit of a hollow idea or ideal now, at least since the first financial crisis of the early 2000s, because state intervention has been so enormous in the economy, all of those stimulus packages that were pumped into the economy. In fact, the state has assumed the role of the market while still giving an impression of this neoliberalism, pure neoliberalism, whereby the market just regulates itself. But in fact, in Southern Europe, for instance, for almost 10 years now, we're paying for the failed banks. So the state is pumping billions of euros into those financial institutions. Now with COVID-19 and all kinds of other enormous stimulus packages that states have put into the economy, I think neoliberalism becomes a kind of hollow idea, a facade that really has nothing behind it, that has a strong state behind it, but a state that is still working on behalf of the very few who are benefiting from those infusions of cash. So. Just one last thing. It's just that whenever we identify the enemy, and this works with capitalism, maybe in a very Hegelian spirit. Just as we identify the enemy is already elsewhere. So we say the enemy is neoliberalism. It's no longer that. It's just a hollow kind of form that has nothing in it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, neoliberalism seems a little passé since it became a mainstream notion. I mean, 10 years ago, my political science colleagues, they didn't know this word. They were reacting very allergically to it. Now everyone in mainstream journals, they write neoliberal state, whatever. So I agree that we should invent some new interesting concepts. But de facto, of course, this idea that you build a class state, a bourgeois state from the top, this neoliberal idea, it remains. But these lyrics about market and entrepreneurship, they indeed a little fade. I actually, in my chapter, I suggest this oxymoronic definition of contemporary state as a welfare deregulationist liberal corporatist state. Because it's at the same time, throughout this period, the welfare policies continue. Neoliberalism, we call it neoliberalism, but compared to, let's say, Russia with its flat tax, United States is a welfare country. I mean, in some degrees, not in all. Compared to China, there was always a dialectical synthesis of, well, in a bad way, of very contradictory values within the neoliberal state. European Union, is it a neoliberal entity, or it is a welfare entity which pushes for social policies? It kind of does both.
I think that it does both, but it does both on different levels. Like it if we think nationally, we do still have, especially in the developed democratic states, we do still have welfare, like Germany, Sweden, and Norway, which I mentioned. But if we think globally, that's a neoliberal state as it exercises its flows of money and the flows of energy and flows of pollution even.
Yeah, no, of course, when they export it, it's more pure, like it is in the Russian case, or in Mongolian case. What they export is neoliberalism, but inside it's more complicated.
I would say these are both connected, that like the welfare state, the welfare policies, they deeply, and democratic policies, parliamentary, liberal democratic policies, they deeply depend on those colonial economic, colonial economic flows. That they are funded by them, actually.
Yeah, sure. No, no one listen. Come here. We have some physical bodies here. They will move.
No, just
This is your regular.
A short notice on what you said. It sounds a bit paradoxical because it is the particular state which is the state of welfare, and the universal one is the neoliberal one. You know, and it's strange. No? Don't you think that it should be? It seems that it should be our.
Should be the opposite.
Yes.
Okay.
How should it be the opposite? I don't understand.
It should be the other way around. I think you admit.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
You mean that? Can you explain it in simpler terms?
I said that on the universal level, the European Union is a neoliberal state, and on the particular level of the national states, it's a welfare state.
Yes.
But it seems strange, no, that the universality is granted by the neoliberalism, and the particularity is on the side of the...
Yeah, built on nation, on the exclusivity of membership. Right. So from the Hegelian point of view, of course, it should be another way around. But neoliberalism is kind of a universal idea, no?
I don't say that neoliberal policies are universal in the sense of as a concept, but I say that this is how the welfare state used to function, and this is how the rich and democratic life of Europe and American society was funded for and provided for many years.
Empirically, we agree. I mean, that's clear. There is a question here. Just a moment. Dmitry, can you please unmute yourself to ask the question?
I'm here. So I got one question following the discussion on neoliberalism, etc. Basically, this neoliberal vision of the subject of a kind of responsible for his own welfare, etc. But still, we have some, well, not we, but they have some still functional welfare structures. And with regard to the current situation with COVID, etc., just a couple of days ago, I heard the discussion between Chantal Mouffe and Paula Gabauda, and they suddenly, like discussing populism, they came to the conclusion that we need a state that gets more and more protective. So they kind of deliberately use the word protection state. So to basically redefine what protection means, what protective state might look like. At the same time, like recent events, we see a kind of backlash from the right that boils down to the question of liberties, right? So you kind of take away our liberties. We don't need your regulations, etc. We don't need your curfew. So, and I'm wondering, between this kind of double duality or opposition between, let's say, welfare protectionist kind of framework and this idea that, well, we might need some liberties, we might need some critical distance. Is there any place for kind of redefinition of the concept of citizenship? In the whole discussion, in the whole debates today, so because this term wasn't used, so I'm wondering, basically want to bring it in.
Anyone wants to comment on citizenship? This was kind of a question that spoke to itself.
Maybe not so much on citizenship as on this return, or the call to return to a protection state, which to me sounds like a very Hobbesian position to take, and to my mind reinforces this idea of the state as standing over and above, standing, and not only standing but towering over all the citizens within it. And then, at least in my intervention, I try to paint the picture of a citizen who is always lower than standing, or in another position than the standing of the state. But then, as a representative of the state, the citizen becomes standing kind of subject. Very clearly, in English, there is this expression, a standing army. So military activities as standing as a possibility of a confrontation among equals, among states, as a standoff, would cast citizens into this sort of a role. But I would say that any function of representing the strong standing state would put a citizen in the role in the position of the state itself that I tried to describe.
Did I mute myself? I didn't mute myself.
Yeah, if I may, I think that, well, the question also posed the challenge. I mean, this idea of, an active and, of course, collective and not atomized or individualistic conception of citizenship can be the answer between a kind of, let's say, protective state that ends up on being repressive, and on the other hand, the absence of, basic social protection. And one might say that you can see it even in the politics of the pandemic, because, for example, one could argue, at least in the European context, which is more familiar to me, that instead, for example, of this kind of blanket measures covering all aspects of life, this idea of suspension of sociality, on the one hand, and on the other hand, this absurd rejection of the idea there's no danger. So there is a middle ground, which means society reorganizing itself in a collective way so as to protect the vulnerable. So in a way that is, includes solidarity and not just, not doing, this kind of even authoritarian interventions from the part of the state. There is room. I think this is the very idea of a new practice of politics, redefining the way that things are, even if this means that there's always, a third choice, not just when you see a very simplistic opposition. This goes to the market. The same goes perhaps to the state. And this is the challenge I think we're facing in many aspects.
I have two comments, not questions, probably more comments. One goes to Olga Bashkina, that you started by commenting on this French-German tradition of the early 20th century. And I think it is significant that many of us turn to this period. Certainly there is a lot of use in the English political theory. There was a moment when Carl Schmitt was fashionable. There are, well, of course, Max Weber is eternally fashionable. But generally, this tradition seems to go in a different direction from the contemporary constitutional thought. Do you think there is a possible reunion, reintegration of it, or do we have a cleavage between the continental and Anglo-Saxon traditions? I see a problem there because, of course, we all mostly operate in the English space, but English space is associated with a certain understanding of statehood, which is very, very different from the French and German one.
Which different direction do you think it goes to? I think it's very identical discussions. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Explain this. No, this I didn't understand at all.
Well, what do you understand as different?
No, I agree with that. Some discussions, like in Ackerman, the question of constituent power are similar. But for instance, as you write in your chapter, of course, constituent power in the contemporary American tradition is celebrated as some kind of historical and spontaneous force, while the French tradition was emphatically less democratic on this. They wanted to figure as more as a principle or as something included into constitution. But this is ideological. No, I mean, for instance, in the German tradition, of course, the state is understood as again as idea, as a political unity. Anglo-American political theory, I mean, predominantly is a pragmatic philosophy. It very emphatically throughout its history denies any idealization of state. Although I understand that, okay, yeah, okay, of course there are exceptions since everyone speaks English, so there is everything. But I think in your chapter you indicated this cleavage.
Well, the interest is not to adopt. Can you mute me, or can you mute your microphone?
I have to mute myself, yes.
Yes, thanks. Well, the interest is not to adopt any particular system from the 19th century, of course, and however they understood the state is not so important. What is interesting and valuable about those 19th century theories of state is that they are properly philosophical. It's a proper systematic thinking, both philosophical and legal, which is such depth of analysis is, you could say, lacking in today's scattered theories of all of these concepts. So it is just a theoretical phenomenon that, well, in the era of systematic thinking, there also existed systematic thinking about politics and law together, which today we have legal theory and constitutional theory on one hand, and we have democratic theory or political theory on the other hand. And it's only now that those merge together, and somehow theorists are discovering that questions of constituent power are both legal and political. But this has already been discussed systematically a century ago. So however particularly they understood the state is not so important. What is important is that it's a really rich philosophical, in the first place, analysis of both politics and law in how they inevitably connect together, and the analysis that needs to be developed today in such depth, I think.
Yep. And I have a comment also to Christian. I like this liturgy exorcism element. And indeed, it has to do with some of Agamben, because I think it's productive to bring together the contemporary emotional element of politics and what previously figured as sacred, ritualistic element of politics. Oops. I wonder if we don't need to push this further, and you know, you speak of exorcism, but one usually writes about this. I, for example, also mentioned this in more modern terms. Like some speak of moral panic, some speak of hysteria, for example. Media, you can speak about media hysteria, media paranoia. So this is the kind of notions that is often used. And if we look at the media in electoral politics today, they very often show these, you know, the elements of big mass emotions, with Trump being like something like a book emissary. For the New York Times and Washington Post. I wonder if there is some kind of one-to-one translation between the old ritual of power and the new forms of political emotion.
I think that's a great question, although I wouldn't say that exorcism or ritual or these terms fall into a pre-modern or anti-modern category, because, you know, if we even just look at the manifesto where Marx is talking about the bourgeois as the sorcerer, and there's all kinds of conjurings happening, and, you know, within anthropology as well, a whole turn to looking at these kinds of spectral and occult economies, anyway, that happen as well. But that will go down a different pathway. But I think you're right. I mean, especially with Trump, some of the language that I use, or at least how I understand it, and I think Trump also actually grasps it and leverages it to his advantage. That the liberal reaction to Trump is one of expulsion, like regardless of the like literally an expelling a sense of disgust or revulsion and a pushing out of the kind of contamination, which then allows Biden to kind of fantasize that he is America, like just simply after Trump, right? After we've somehow overcome this disease. So I think that I wouldn't say that any of these terminologies are necessarily mutually exclusive. It just depends on the argument you want to make. But, you know, just like you said, like 10 years ago in political science, neoliberalism didn't even enter the conversation. I would also say for a long time, you know, emotions, affects were looked at as epiphenomenal or something done in literary or queer studies or philosophy or other things, like, you know, but now it's really hard. I think, you know, philosophically, one of the positive things of Trump is it's made it hard to avoid the question of the mobilization of different emotions, and one thing, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm mainly a specialist of Chinese politics, and I'm working on Mongolia as my second kind of project. But I would say that, you know, one thing that the Chinese Communist Party has kind of masterfully created a political technology for is this mobilization of emotion. And I like to, and it's interesting to see I edited a volume called The Afterlives of Chinese Communism that if anybody's interested in, it's with Verso, but it's also open access, so you could download it for free. And Haiyan Li has a really interesting point in her chapter called Class Feeling that I think is relevant to our discussion today, which is, from the left, how do we think of a project of enacting or state power, governing or mobilizing mass politics without actually thinking of what would a class feeling and emotion actually be. And unfortunately, I forgot who mentioned this earlier. Sorry, my 18-month-old son is just running around like crazy right now. So, but that the right, I think maybe it was Agon. I forgot. I apologize if I'm misattributing. But that the right has the scary thing is the right internationalism, right, or this kind of resonance among different right-wing movements. And then the question is how do we produce left-wing a kind of leftist channels to mobilize emotion, and so anyway, in this chapter by Haiyan Li, she works through the examples of basically looking at the Maoist state apparatus as really being an apparatus of generating political emotion. And now that's turned and recoded itself into a much more nationalistic framework in China, but we really need to take that seriously as a political project as well. So thanks. I don't know if that answers your question, but
thank you. And I think the last question goes to Mikhail Fedorchenko, who had a question. Mikhail, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Greetings to such wonderful organizers. I have a question regarding the neoliberalism and the state apparatus in general. As I see it, the whole premise of democratical procedures, the pandemic situation, and reimagining and or reassembling the statehood as a whole somewhat contradicts with mainstream mass imaginary and protests that we've seen in the last year or so. For example, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone or some other non-state and communitarian projects born out from ideas of Murray Bookchin or Peter Gelder-Loss or some other theoreticists. And I think that's a question that I would like to address to all the speakers, that is it really necessary to reimagine the state as some wholesome and wholesome project, or we can use some confederational, some communitarian or direct democratical processes to reimagine this valuable state power that can be reproduced through this grassroots activism.
Well, Mikhail, as you heard, we have different varying responses to this. I certainly am not a friend of any anarchism, as you know. And I do think that confederational and direct democratic elements are absolutely vital, and they have to be included into the constitutional state. While if this doesn't happen, then the ruling form will be authoritarian state, authoritarian neoliberal state, which we already have, or civil war with genocides and all of that. So why do we need it? I don't think we need it. I think we need to build democracy from top. But certainly not, I'm sure not everyone here has such radical views. Maria wants to say.
Yeah, I want to say that as you asked whether any of us think that federalist and other forms of horizontal democratic communities are to be can confront the state or a neoliberal state, right?
My question was whether these projects can be re-envisioned in a work of this discussion and the role of state in general. Can the state be somewhat reassembled with these communitarian practices? I think that's a true leftist libertarian way of thinking about the statehood in general nowadays, that these practices must not only coexist with states and state apparatuses, but they must be some like of autonomous practices that can be explicated through the whole territory of the state, like an whole country as an autonomous zone of sorts. Can it be possible?
I think that first, anything is possible, so we don't know. Of course, like we can imagine a whole state, a whole country is an autonomous zone. But I also think that, like in my view, autonomy has its limits, because when we posit such negativity towards the powers of the state, which can be both negative and both positive, so we tend to view the state as something which brings coercion, surveillance, and things like that. But at the same time, we use a lot of its resources, as we said, the welfare state, the funding, the universities, the grants, I mentioned there is a book, for example, which is called The Entrepreneurial State, which discovers how many of today's
Mazzucato, right?
Yes, Mazzucato. Which discovers how many of today's technologies are provided by the state. They are viewed as the product of capitalism and corporations and all the technological giants, but they actually come from the project that the state funds. So I think that we have this wheel somehow of the state, that the state is not monolithic, but it's like kind of like a mosaic and puzzle, which we can take apart, part by part.
My God. God forbid, but okay, try. Any other responses or concluding remarks? Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for contributing to this book, which is actually beautiful. Unfortunately, the European part of the publishing house is slow to send the copies, I know, but I hope they eventually will arrive. And we will come back to some of these slides. Maybe we have new projects and new conferences to come. So keep in touch and follow the events of this Stasis Center for Practical Philosophy, which organized this event and where some of us work. Thank you. Bye-bye.